Thought I would do another episode that the left doesn't really understand the right. Another information set from Thomas Sowell. It's really one of these things that there just simply isn't a historian quite like this man. And one of the main reasons is because of his admission, like so many other black Americans, myself included. Now, while he was an avowed Marxist, I suppose, I guess it was avowed, but I don't know. He also had served in the Marines, and he went into economics, and he just couldn't prove any of his ideas. No matter how hard he tried, he simply could not find, when he would do the best possible research, with all the econometrics included, he couldn't make it happen. It was because socialist economics is just garbage. It's not real. It's not real economics. It's just state control. That's why everybody wants to presume Schindler was selling to somebody. No, he was buying from the government, selling to the government. He didn't really own a company. He was just the guy who ran it. He was in the party. That's how it works. Just like China. You're just in the party, so you get to run something maybe one day. If everybody doesn't jump off the roof. Intellectuals and War, from Thomas Sowell's Intellectuals and Society. The Second World War, intellectuals between the world wars. While the First World War reinforced the dirigiste tendencies of both the intelligentsia and of many in the political arena, it devastated the notions of those intellectuals who saw war as a beneficial social tonic domestically or a good means to spread progressive policies internationally. Despite those intellectuals who had rallied to the military interventionist policies of Woodrow Wilson in Latin America, and in Europe, the unprecedented horrors and devastations of the First World War turned virtually the whole intellectual community of the Western world in the opposite direction, toward pacifism. Indeed, pacifism became a widespread attitude among much of the population at large, and therefore a potent political force in democratic nations. No matter how drastically intellectuals had been forced to change their minds, in the wake of the First World War they remained as convinced as ever that their views on the subject of war and peace were vastly superior to the views of the general public. Part of the reason for the spread of pacifism were circumstances, especially the grim and heart-rending experiences of the First World War, and part was due to how people reacted to circumstances, especially the intelligentsia. Most severely, the intelligentsia in France, which suffered most among the Western democracies. The most fundamental of these circumstances were the stark facts of that war itself. About 1,400,000 French lost their lives. Well over 1 million had been gassed, disfigured, mangled, amputated, left permanent invalids. Wheelchairs, crutches, empty sleeves dangling loosely or tucked into pockets became common sights. More than that had suffered some sort of wound. Half of the 6,500,000 who survived the war had sustained injuries. Most visible, 1,100,000 were those who had been evidently diminished and were described as mutilés. I know I just murdered that. I mutilated that. A term the dictionary translates as maimed or mangled, and the English usage prefers to clothe in a euphemism, disabled. With most of the war on the Western Front fought on its own territory, France suffered tremendous casualties in the First World War. More than 1/4 of all Frenchmen between the ages of 18 and 27 were killed in the First World War. Moreover, neither the financial nor the human costs of the First World War ended when the war itself ended. Although the number of males and females in France's population were roughly equal before the war, the massive wartime casualties among young Frenchmen meant that in the 1930s, the number of women between the ages of 20 and 40 exceeded the number of men of those ages by more than 1 million, meaning that more than 1 million women in the prime of life could not fulfill traditional expectations of becoming wives and mothers. During the 1930s, there were not enough babies born in France to replace the people who died during that decade. The sense of faith in the French government was also devastated, as people who had patriotically invested in bonds to help finance the First World War saw the value of those bonds drastically reduced by inflation, cheating some citizens out of their life savings. No country was more fertile soil for pacifism and demoralization. No one created more of both than France's intelligentsia. Anti-war novels and the memoirs of military veterans found a vast market in France. A translation of the anti-war classic, All Quiet on the Western Front, sold 72,000 copies in 10 days, and nearly 450,000 copies by Christmas. La Humanité serialized it, and Ep.4-Intellectuals praised it. In 1938, the year of the Munich appeasement of Hitler, Echo de la Nieve, that one I can't, I'm not even going to try to really pronounce it, Nieva, said anything rather than war. Novelist Jean, I'm trying to figure out if this would be a hard G, Guillaume, long critical of his own French government, likewise urged acceptance of Hitler's terms at Munich. Very similar trends were apparent in Britain in the years between the two world wars. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the pacifist mood was being fueled by the flow of memoirs and novels exploring the horrors of the Great War. Richard Aldington's Death of a Hero and Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of a Fox-Hunting Man were published in 1928, and Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, Ernest Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, and Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front appeared in 1929. Louis Milestone's film of Remarque's book had a powerful impact. In addition to many anti-war novels about the First World War, 80 or more novels about the horrors of future wars were published in Britain between the First and Second World Wars. One of the remarkable developments of the 1920s was an international movement among intellectuals promoting the idea that nations should get together and publicly renounce war. As prominent British intellectual Harold Laski put it, the experience of what world conflict has involved seems to have convinced the best of this generation that the effective outlawry of war is the only reasonable alternative to suicide. In the United States, John Dewey spoke of those who were skeptical of this movement for the international renunciation of war that he supported, which led to the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 as people with stupidity of habit-bound mind. He saw arguments against the renunciation of wars coming from those who believe in the war system. With Lasky, Dewey, and others, the issue was not simply a matter of one hypothesis about war and peace versus another, but was a question of the anointed versus the benighted, the latter being dismissed with contempt, rather than having their arguments answered. Being a pacifist in the 1920s and 1930s was a badge of honor, and pacifist phrases facilitated admission to the circles of the self-congratulatory elites. At a 1935 rally of the British Labour Party, economist Roy Herod heard a candidate proclaim that Britain ought to disarm as an example to others, a very common argument at the time. His response and the answer it provoked captured the spirit of the times. "You think our example will cause Hitler and Mussolini to disarm?" I asked. "Oh, Roy," she said, "have you lost all your idealism?" Others likewise presented pacifism in personal rather than policy terms. Author J.M. Murray, for example, said, "What mattered is that men and women should bear their witness." However, pacifist Marguerite South objected to pacifism becoming a precious doctrine, which has as its objective the regeneration of the individual rather than the prevention of war. Here, as in other cases, the vision of the anointed was a vision about themselves, not just about the ostensible issue at hand. Like Marguerite South, John Maynard Keynes also objected to having national policies be based on the urge to save one's own soul. Given the high personal psychic stakes for pacifists, it is not surprising that those with a contrary opinion on issues of war and peace, as on other issues, were lashed out at as personal enemies or as people threatening their soul, and were demonized rather than answered. As noted in Chapter 4, Bertrand Russell claimed that the man who opposed pacifism was someone who delights in war and would hate a world from which it had been eliminated. In a very similar vein, H.G. Wells spoke of a substantial portion of human beings who definitely like war, know they like war, and want it, and seek it. Kingsley Martin, longtime editor of the influential New Statesman, likewise characterized Winston Churchill in 1931 as someone whose mind is confined to a militaristic mold, as a psychological explanation of Churchill's advocacy of keeping the French army and the British navy at full strength. More generally, Kingsley Martin treated those whose views differed from his own regarding war and peace as having psychological defects. Rather than having arguments that required being answered with other arguments, to have a foreign enemy in the offing enables us to hate with a good conscience. It is only in time of war that we get a complete moral holiday, when all the things which we have learned at our mother's knee, all the moral inhibitions imposed by education and society, can be wholeheartedly thrown aside, when it becomes justifiable to hit below the belt, when it is one's duty to lie, and killing is no longer murder. In short, the unworthiness of opponents was taken as axiomatic, making substantive arguments against their arguments unnecessary. Kingsley Martin was not alone. Churchill's colleagues in Parliament were equally dismissive. Such views were not peculiar to British and American intellectuals. The French intelligentsia played a major role in the promotion of pacifism between the two world wars. Even before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, internationally renowned French writer Romain Rolland, recipient of France's Grand Prix de Littérature, later elected to the Russian Academy of Science and offered the Goethe Prize by Germany, and recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, issued a manifesto calling on intellectuals in all countries to oppose militarism and nationalism in order to promote peace. In 1926, prominent intellectuals from a number of countries signed an internationally publicized petition calling for some definite step toward complete disarmament and the demilitarizing of the mind of civilized nations. Among those who signed were H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell in England, and Romain Rolland and Georges Duhamel in France. The petition called for a ban on military conscription, in part to rid the world of the spirit of militarism. Behind such arguments was the crucial assumption that both physical and moral disarmament were necessary to sustain peace. Neither in this petition nor in other statements expressing similar views was there much, if any, expressed concern that both kinds of disarmament would leave the disarmed nations at the mercy of those nations which did not disarm in either sense, thus making a new war look more attractive to the latter because it would look more winnable. Hitler, for example, banned the anti-war classic All Quiet on the Western Front, as he wanted neither moral nor physical disarmament in Germany, but carefully followed both phenomena in Western democracies as he plotted his moves against them. Pacifists of this era seem not to think of other nations as prospective enemies, but of war itself as the enemy, with weapons of war and those who manufactured these weapons, merchants of death, being the fashionable phrase of the times, and the title of a best-selling 1934 book, also being enemies. The merchants of death wax fat and bloated, declared John Dewey in 1935. Romain Rolland called them the profiteers of massacre. H.G. Wells said, war equipment has followed blindly upon industrial advance until it has become a monstrous and immediate danger to the community. Harold Lasky spoke of the wickedness of armaments. Aldous Huxley referred to a battleship as a repulsive insect, a huge bug which squatted there on the water, all its poisonous armory enlarged into instruments of destruction, every bristle a gun, every pore a torpedo tube, and added, men had created this enormous working model of a loathsome insect for the express purpose of destroying other men. I'll read a little bit more about the pacifists and their effect on society at another point. Again, Intellectuals in Society, Thomas Sowell. So the moral of this story, for those of you who are on the left, and if you're not getting it, the last one I did, American Islam was possibly, Islam in the West is fundamentally, without the Salafi movement, there wouldn't be Islam in the West. Without odd offshoots of Islam that would be unfamiliar to most Muslims throughout the world, Islam would not exist in the Western world. Without pseudo-Islam, Islam would not exist in the Western world. It's only been since about the 50s and on that there's been anyone who, there's some kind of like Quran reading, like 5 times a day Sharia following Muslim. That 5 times a day thing, that's, so you understand, that is fundamentally Sharia. Like it's not that it's not. Some people just don't follow it to the letter of the law. And there's nobody who runs around with a stick to beat them up. But that's a part of it. That would be a part of it. It's Sharia, yeah. You all on the left don't research Sharia. You really don't. You go out of your way to not really know what you're talking about when it comes to that. You don't understand the Sirah. You don't look into what the Hadiths say. You don't care. So the last one was about Freemasonic and secret societies, and that they have a ken for various odd forms of Islam, and that most of what we know about Islam comes from the former Janissaries, the Bektashi Sufis, and that's where we get the Shrine Degree in Freemasonry from. That's where we get fundamentally the Nation of Islam from, is based off of the Shrine Degree, and we get most of other secret societies and sort of spiritual organizations based off of the Shrine Degree and sort of pseudo-Islam. Then I do a thing on propaganda, Edward Bernays, and his famous book. You should just have it. It's a very short book. You should own it. Once you own propaganda, you literally you'll start seeing code. That is the one of the key red pills. And if you own it, you own it. I say own it in paper and write notes in it. Because at some point you're going to throw up in your lap. You're just simply not going to believe that, like, wait. No, what you just said means you invented that entire concept. Or that you start to see how music, movies, television, why we have a thing called the suburbs, all of it. You start to, you just want to fucking vomit. People need to be controlled. Everyone desires everything. So we have to narrow those choices. Once you want to affix something to the media, you must drop the pen. But from there, you must decide what you're going to write. And from there, you limit yourself. It's a fundamental concept of Kabbalah and creation. When you create, once you start, you have to keep going. And the more you do, the more you limit yourself. And it's a hard thing to keep order. If it's supposed to stay orderly, you have to limit yourself. So, intellectuals in society highly recommend. Pacifism was entirely just smart people telling you this. Just like now you have all these smart people arguing that Islam, it's strange, people are perverting Islam, all these places where women are wrapped in fucking cloth. Oh, that's not how it really is. Then why is it so popular? Why was actually most of the Islamic world not like that? And that it's become that way. As things have gotten more modern, as women have started to vote, as women have owned cars and like fighting wars and shit in the Middle East, they're wrapped in more fucking cloth all the time. You all really aren't doing your research. You don't know what we know, and you need to find out.